Thank God for girlfriends. In this crazy, chaotic, divided world that was run by men, you could count on the women. This is According to Your English Teacher, and I'm Sam Gunther. Today we will be doing a deep dive into Kristen Hanna's The Women. Last week I did an overview on plot, characters, and I covered a few themes, but this week I wanted to focus in on the title focus, The Women. This book is a tribute to the veterans of Vietnam, but it mostly focuses on the contributions of women in this war. The first half of this book deals with the horrors of war, and the second half covers how our main character deals with those horrors. In this video, we will be looking at impactful scenes and dissecting quotes. We will also be talking about the ideas that the author was trying to teach us about the war. The Vietnam War started in 1955 and didn't end until 1970. According to the National Archives, 58,220 American lives were lost, though if we use this book as a source, that number might not be comprehensive. This war was unique in American history because it was a war that was largely protested, and many Americans did not think America should be involved in Vietnam at all, and the government kept the reality of the war from its citizens. In her podcast focusing on the 70s, Sharon McMahon talks about the Pentagon Papers and a researcher who proved that our involvement in the Vietnam War was detrimental and the actions of Nixon and his predecessors in the war was unethical. The publishing of these papers were groundbreaking, and I highly recommend that you listen to that podcast for more information about the government's involvement in keeping the war stats away from the public. I know this war was not discussed in any of my history classes. We discussed World War II at length, but many other wars get little to no attention. When teaching about this war, the focus is largely on the people who protested it and the home front. So I was grateful for a book that focused on the men and women who fought in the Vietnam War and served their country. This perspective is much needed, in my opinion. Knowing all of this, let's return to the text. Frankie comes from a line of patriots. Her grandfather served in World War I, and her father, Connor McGrath, was unfortunately not allowed to serve in World War II due to health issues, but he was an outspoken champion for veterans and dedicated some of his career to helping veterans find housing. Frankie and her brother Finley grew up hearing stories of their grandfather, and they knew all the people on their wall of heroes very well. In one word, they were patriots. Growing up in this environment and being a good Catholic girl, Frankie is caring and eager to serve her country, and she might just be a little bit naive. After talking to Walsh in her father's office, Frankie has an interesting thought. Why had it never occurred to her that a girl, a woman, could have a place on her father's office wall for doing something heroic or important? That a woman could invent or discover something, or could be a nurse on the battlefield, could literally save lives. End quote. I love this moment because it gives us insight into so many things. First of all, we get to see how Frankie has viewed her role of womanhood, that women were meant to have kids and start families. She's from a very traditional family, and she is expected to find a good boy and start a family of her own, not run away to war. However, she clearly wants to be on that wall for other reasons. Who wouldn't want to be a part of something when they've been told their whole lives that they belong to a family of heroes? After her conversation with Walsh, Frankie goes to enlist. She runs into a group of protesters, and here are her thoughts. Two men with long hair were burning their draft cards, which was illegal, while the crowd cheered them on. Frankie had never understood these protests. Did they really think that a few protesters would convince LBJ to stop the war? Did they not understand that if Vietnam would fall to communism, that all of Southeast Asia would? End quote. I have seen many portrayals of this time period, but most of the ones I have seen are about the draft burning side. The most notable portrayal I can think of is Across the Universe, where one of the main characters becomes involved in protesting the war. It's interesting to see someone with the other perspective who is also genuinely concerned with the world, just in a different way. She cares about the people in Asia and doesn't want them to lose religion and succumb to the woes of communism. The next notable scene is when Frankie tells her parents she enlisted, and on that same day, they learn that her brother was killed in action. This news devastates her parents, and her father seems to be the most impacted. He turns in on himself and doesn't really talk to anybody about what happened. Frankie, however, seems to have the opposite reaction of her parents, and although she is sad she won't see her brother at war, the words her brother had written to her while he was at war motivate Frankie to go. He said that he found himself in the war, and that is what Frankie wants to do, find herself in a cause. Frankie's first few days in Vietnam are an eye-opener for her. She catches a stomach bug from drinking the water, and you can tell from the description that living in a jungle could be absolutely miserable if you're not used to it. The heat, the bugs, just misery. The first time Frankie meets Ethel and Barb, she seems so overwhelmed. She sees Barb and realizes that she hasn't had many conversations with black women before, and immediately notices that she doesn't want to cross this one. Ethel, on the other hand, seems to know everything, and she takes Frankie under her wing. She isn't necessarily kind and compassionate about it, but she's considerate of Frankie's feelings. I love these quotes from their first interaction. "A girdle," Ethel says with a sigh. "Don't worry, it's not just you. They don't tell us the truth about what to wear over here." "Or anything else," Barb said. "It's a party," Barb said, "not a John Wayne movie. Take that shit off." But Frankie turned too fast, her helmet falling off her head. "Regulations state." Barb walks out. Ethel gently took Frankie's helmet off and tossed it on the bed. "Look, I know today is a lot. We will help you fit in, I promise. But not now, okay? And as for the flak jacket, just no, okay?" From this first interaction, you can see so much about each of these women. Frankie is young and naive and a rule follower. Barb is a tough nut to crack. She cares, but it takes a minute to get her to warm up to you. And Ethel is kind and caring, but also good at setting boundaries. Frankie's first day at work is something she is clearly not prepared for. Not only is she late, but she's hung over. Here is a small snippet of that day. Frankie found the Quonset hut that housed the emergency room. Medics are in and out, carrying men on litters. One lay screaming, his own severed leg on his chest. Another had no legs at all. Frankie was overwhelmed by the horror of it. The screaming, the smoke, the shouting. A medic saw Frankie standing there and shoved a boot in her hand. She stared down at it and saw that a foot was inside. End quote. There is a reason that the other branches of the military wanted Frankie to have 2 years of service before coming to war, because it's no walk in the park. Here's another scene from that day. "Keep breathing, Frank," Ethel said calmly. "Hold his hand." Frankie positioned herself at the patient's side and forced herself to look down. At first, all she saw was the horror, the devastating amount of blood. "Focus, Frankie." She closed her eyes for a second, exhaled, and then opened her eyes. Frankie was not trained for this. "We need your help." She shook her head. Ethel touched Frankie's chin, made her look up. "I know," she said, pushing the hair back with a bloody hand. "I know. But just hold his hand. Sometimes that's all we can do. And then come back here." End quote. This moment is so important for Frankie because it teaches her her role. Sometimes the best thing she can do is sit at the bedside of these soldiers and hold their hand and remind them of home. This scene is so excellently written. You can feel Frankie's anxiety and understand why she would be horrified at a scene like that. I'm not sure what she expected when she signed up for war, but it wasn't this. Later, back in their room together, Ethel says something I love. "Look, Frank, I know how you feel right now. We all do. We've been there. You're thinking you screwed up by signing up for Nam, thinking you don't belong. But let me tell you, kid, It doesn't matter where you're from or how you grew up or what God you believe in. If you're here, you're among friends. We've got you." End quote. I love this moment of friendship. It's exactly what Frankie needed to hear. These women have each other's backs. The first doctor that Frankie trains with is Ted Smith in the neuro unit. He trains her to become a good nurse, and being in this unit keeps Frankie away from the real trauma of war. One quote that Dr. Smith says is, "We've developed skills to save their bodies, but not their lives." I thought this was such an insightful quote, and it gives us hints on the traumas that these boys and Frankie will suffer on later in life. As I talked about in the last video, on slow days, the medical staff was able to leave the camp and go give local people medical aid. These moments were a spot of sunshine in Frankie's life. Not only giving medical aid, but being able to ride in the helicopters and see the stunning landscapes in Vietnam. I wanted to pull a quote from this scene. "A nothing little rock, something she'd ordinarily ignore. In her palm, it became a talisman, a reminder that hopefully a girl would grow into adulthood because of her work on that day. Yes, that girl would join a generation of amputees who'd survived the war, but she could run and play and marry and hold a child in her arms." "You did well, Frankie," Barb said. "There might be hope for you after all." End quote. I loved this look into Frankie's mind. I'm sure it's difficult to feel like you're making a difference when everyone around you is dying. But in this camp, Frankie is able to see that she really can make a difference, and that means the world to her. Frankie gets the hang of things and is starting to get her bearings. She gets letters from home and from her mother. In one of them, her mother says, "Things change for men, Francis. For women, it stays pretty much the same." I thought this was very insightful and a bit sad. I wonder what life must have been like for her mom. In her letters from her mother, she also gets updates on the home front, how people are protesting the war, and how the world is changing. I thought this was an interesting way to get that kind of information. This way we could see both sides of the war without having two different characters. Frankie had been there a while when Jamie and the girls convince her to join the OR team. She would work directly with Jamie, and he trains her to become an excellent surgery nurse. Here's a small scene from her first day. "Right, come with me." Frankie moved through the OR, realizing halfway across that Jamie was close enough to keep her moving forward. He led her to a young man who lay on a gurney. "This is D&I, debride and irrigate. That's a frag wound. We need to stop that bleeding and remove the metal fragments and cut away the dead skin. Then we irrigate with saline. We make little holes out of big ones. Can you help me?" She shook her head. He stared down at her and said softly, "Look at me." She exhaled slowly and looked up to him. "No fear, McGrath. You can do this." "No fear. Right. Yes," she lied. "Yes, of course." End quote. From then on, Frankie is part of the surgery team. She becomes a great nurse thanks to Jamie and her friends. She starts to do things that scare her, reminding herself that she needs to focus. Throughout the war, Frankie only becomes further disillusioned. All around her, she's seeing terrible things happen, yet in the newspaper they are allowed to read, called the Stars and Stripes, there is no reporting of the deaths and bombings she is seeing every day. Here are some quotes that show this disillusionment. "Casualties," she reminded herself. Back in the world, they were patients. Here, they were casualties. Frankie couldn't stop thinking about Mai, lying in a ditch, burned. War was one thing. Bombing villages full of women and children was something else. God knew there was no stories about it in the Stars and Stripes. Why weren't they reporting the truth? There were more than 450,000 American men in Vietnam now, and God knows how many deaths and casualties. You certainly couldn't find that answer in the Stars and Stripes. Many of the new troops in the country had barely been 6 weeks in training. Unlike in World War II, when soldiers had trained together in platoons and went to war alongside men with whom they'd trained, these new recruits came in and were dropped wherever. Frankie wondered, Who the hell decided that less training for war was a good idea, but no one had asked her opinion? End quote. Not everything that happened in the book was sad, though. There are other patches of sunshine. For example, occasionally the crew is able to leave the base to go party in another base. At one of these parties, Frankie learns how to water ski. These moments help us to remember that these were kids fighting this war. Some were only 18 or 19 years old. These moments also help us to get to know our characters more and help us to understand what being at war meant. One party that Frankie goes to is Ethel's goodbye party. Saying goodbye to Ethel was difficult for Frankie, but she was also happy for her friend. They don't get a real goodbye, but that's because Ethel knows they are going to see each other again. Here's a reflection of Frankie's thoughts in this moment. War is full of goodbyes, and most of them never really happen. You were always too early or too late. Like with Finley, she had said goodbye to her brother long after the words could have really mattered to him. That was one thing this war had taught her. There was never enough time with the people who mattered. After Ethel leaves, Jamie is on his way to visit his family on leave when his helicopter is shot down. He is alive, but only barely. They're getting ready to move him to the larger hospital so he has the hopes of recovering. In transit, they lose him, and Frankie never learns if he survives or not. Here's a quote from this scene. Frankie reached into her pocket and pulled out the felt-tip marker and the small gray stone she had been given by the young Vietnamese boy. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he pressed it into her palm. It'd become a talisman for her. She wrote, "You fight," on one side of the stone and McGrath on the other. She slipped it into his duffel bag. This little rock seems to be a symbol of Frankie's hope. When the boy gives it to her, she has hope again. When she gives it to Jamie, her hope leaves, and she doesn't truly get it back again until she sees Jamie again at the end of the novel. After losing Jamie, Frankie is sent to Pleiku, also known as Rocket City. This is one of the most difficult areas of the war, and thankfully for Frankie, Barb goes with her. Frankie also trains her first nurse, Wilma, in this area, but I couldn't imagine being a brand new nurse in such a difficult area. Frankie's time in Pleiku is mostly dark. However, her time there makes her an excellent nurse. She's not only good at holding soldiers' hands when they pass, but she also performs a tracheotomy and saves a soldier's life. Although she's scared for her life, Frankie feels like she has a purpose and she knows what she's doing is saving lives. One of the most powerful moments in this area was in this moment here. The infant was still alive. "Dear God," Frankie said under her breath. "How could that be?" With care, she picked up the infant, who couldn't have been much older than 3 months. "Hey, little one," she says, her voice breaking. Thin white ribs shone through the gaping wounds and burns on her chest. "I'm so sorry, baby," Frankie said. The baby drew in an uneven breath and exhaled slowly, then went still. No one would ever know who this child was, or even that she had lived and died. How could this be done, even in the name of war? End quote. This moment was devastating. There are no words. To me, this shows the author's viewpoint of war and its effect on people. I know that Frankie re-ups her service and stays for another year, but either that didn't end up happening or that second year went by like a drop of the hat, because next thing you know, Frankie is leaving to go home. After the war, Frankie tries to assimilate back into her regular life. She's living with her parents and trying to figure out what life is like now. However, it is clear that internally she's not okay. When she hears a noise that sounds like a gunshot, she drops to the ground. She's having nightmares that she's back in the war, and everyone is treating her like she's been living in Italy instead of at war. These behaviors are symptoms we now recognize as PTSD, but that wasn't a disorder that people knew about in the mid to late 60s. When Frankie learns that Rye has passed away, she's absolutely heartbroken. Thankfully, Barb and Ethel come to the rescue after having a difficult conversation. Barb was there to help Frankie. Here's a quote from that scene. "Life has to go on, Frank," Ethel said. "You're tough enough for Pleiku. You can survive this." Ah, life goes on. But does it really? Not the same life, that was for sure. The question was how? How did you get through grief? How could you want to live again when you couldn't imagine that life could be? How could you be happy again? End quote. In this moment, you could see the women around Frankie bolstering her, but she cannot get out of this funk. However, when her friends return home, Frankie promises to live her life. Her friends tell her that it may feel like she has nothing, but then reminded her she still has nursing. So Frankie gets a job. She feels belittled by the night shift of nursing, and because she doesn't have any formal nursing experience, she's not able to jump straight into surgery nursing again. She'd been at her job a while, and things were starting to feel normal when a young boy came in and he was suffering injuries much like those she had seen at war. When she cannot find a doctor, Frankie performs a trach and loses her job since she cost the hospital a major lawsuit. At this point, Frankie hits a new low. She's drinking and not sleeping. She gets in an argument with her father about why she isn't on the wall, and he kicks her out of the house. Frankie heads to the VA to try to get help. Let's take a look at this moment. Can I help? She sank into the chair in front of the desk. I was in the country for 2 years, and my boyfriend was to come home in April, but he was KIA, so what came as a regret to inform you telegram, and the way people treat us. We can't even say Vietnam. We want to serve our country, and they call us baby killers. And she continues this story until the doctor asks, Are you menstruating now? Frankie took a moment to process that. I told you I'm having trouble after being in Vietnam, and that's your question? You were in Vietnam? There were no women in Vietnam, dear. Do you have thoughts of hurting yourself, hurting others? You won't help me? I'm here for veterans. I am a veteran. In combat? Well, no, but see, you'll be fine. Trust me. Go home, go out with friends, fall in love again. You're young. Just forget about Vietnam. Oh man. After reading that whole confrontation, I was enraged. This poor young woman clearly has been through so much, and her feelings are just swept under the rug like she'd be fine. I know that there is still much we need to do to help veterans in this country to recover after the war, but I'm glad that things have gotten so much better in 2024 compared to the 1960s. After her failed attempt at the VA, Barb comes to take Frankie to Virginia, where Ethel, Barb, and Frankie find a property and work together to fix up that property and take care of each other. Each of these young women grows up in their time together. I love this show of female friendship. Just like at war, these women were there for each other. I feel like we often get depictions of men at war coming home and having a brotherhood. It was so nice to see a story of women coming home and having a sisterhood. It might have been smaller than those bands of men, but this band of women is just as unstoppable. Frankie's able to start moving past the war. The three of them try not to discuss the war together, and they help each other to achieve their goals. The only reason that Frankie thinks about the war at this point is because Barb does activist work. They go together to a rally against the Vietnam War, and again we're told that there were no women in the war. However, Frankie does find a way to help the war by talking to the veterans' wives. From this point until near the end of the book, Frankie is able to keep her feelings under wraps. She keeps herself busy by helping wives of POWs and taking care of her mother. Then she meets Danny Avocado, and everything seems to be going well. Every once in a while, Danny would find her on the ground because of fireworks or car engines, but things had been going well for Frankie. Then she gets pregnant. A few months into her pregnancy, the war ends and the POWs come home. She's watching them get off the plane on the news when she sees Rye. This sends Frankie into a spiral. She's already questioning her love with Danny. I'm not sure if she truly didn't love him or if this was her trauma manifesting, but seeing Rye was just the beginning of the end for her. Frankie goes to the tarmac to pick up Rye, and that's when she learns that he's married and has a daughter. For the rest of the book, Frankie goes into a downward spiral. She loses her baby, she ends her relationship with Danny, she starts an affair with Rye, she gets addicted to drugs, she loses her job, she almost kills a biker, and she attempts suicide. She also tried to get help from the VA, but she is turned away from a group session because she is a woman and men wouldn't talk with her there. It's so sad to see that she didn't get the help she needed until too late. Danny is finally able to get her the help she needs. Frankie is finally able to talk about the horrible things she saw in Vietnam, and she works with a group of veterans like herself. Frankie describes herself coming back into life as if the sun is shining on her again. After she leaves her hospital, her parents are there to help, but so is Barb. Let's look at a quote from this reunion. "Hey," she said. Frankie laughed out loud. "Who called you? Mom? Henry? I'm surrounded by snitches." "Uh-huh. You think I let you go in search of your life alone, did you? You're married with stepkids. You don't have to sweep in and fill my empty life with your own, you know." Barb rolled her eyes. "You're my best friend, Frankie," she said. And that was that. I love this moment. Barb mentions that Ethel wanted to come as well, but she was 8 months pregnant. These women are always there for each other, especially when it's the most difficult. The powerful female friendships is extended when Frankie starts a home for women like her. Here's a quote that shows this. "The beautiful, unexpected byproduct of helping other women was that Frankie found her own passion again, her own pride. She loved this place fiercely, loved the life she'd forged in the wilderness, loved the women who came to her for help and helped her in return. She woke up each morning with hope, and each summer her friends and family showed up to spend as much vacation time as possible on the ranch. It became a haven for them too." Here's another beautiful quote from a woman, Liz, that stays with Frankie on the ranch. "But we aren't strangers, are we? We are the women who went to war, the nurses of Vietnam, and many of us felt silenced at home. We lost who we were, who we wanted to be, but I'm living proof that it can get better. You can get better. It starts here, in these chairs, reminding ourselves and each other that we are not alone." End quote. And that quote right there wraps up what this novel is about. These women who gave up a piece of themselves for their countries, and just like the men in war, felt lost in coming home. The resolution of this book was a perfect ending for a book about real life. It wraps up the themes and gives us hope that Frankie will find happiness at the end of her life. Here are a few quotes from the end. This is Frankie's father. "You think I feel guilty for urging my son to go to war? I do. It's a thing I live with." He swallowed hard. "But I feel more guilty about how I treated my daughter when she came home." Frankie drew in a sharp breath. How long had she waited for him to say those words? "You're the hero, aren't you, Frankie?" Tears blurred in her vision. "I don't know about a hero, Dad, but I served my country, yeah." "I love you, Peanut," he said in a rough voice, "and I'm sorry." "I'm proud of my service, Dad. It's taken me a long time to say that. I'm proud, even if the war never should have happened, even if it went to hell." End quote. I love that moment. The other moment I loved was Frankie's reunion with Jamie. In that moment, Jamie gives Frankie her rock back. As I mentioned earlier, this rock seems to be Frankie's hope. Her getting it back at the end of the novel brought everything back in full circle. It was the perfect end to the story. Neither of these characters stopped fighting. My favorite thing that Kristen Hanna does at the end of her books is give you the idea that the main character was the one who wrote the book, that the characters in the book were so real, and they wrote these words so you could remember them. She ends this book with Frankie saying she would find some way for people to remember what had happened. Maybe this is Kristen Hanna's way of paying tribute to the people who lived in these times. Her books are so well researched, and it's like you jump into that time. You can hear their music in your head and understand what it might have been like during this time period. I'm truly grateful for her writing, and I look forward to reading more of her books. There were so many powerful moments in this book that I was not able to hit in this video. What are some of your favorite parts and why? Let me know in the comments below. As I said at the beginning of this video, there were two main topics in this book. So let's talk about the themes from these topics. The first one I'd like to discuss is war. The first theme I saw is that conflicts are never one-sided. The people who fight in wars know this better than anyone. There are always people on both sides of the problem. We see this in so many places in the book. When Frankie becomes disillusioned with the war, when she takes care of the Vietnamese people, and most powerfully when she holds that tiny infant in her arms. The second takeaway is we cannot forget that those who go to war never really leave it. Those who sacrifice their lives sacrifice a piece of themselves, and we shouldn't forget them. Frankie is hardly an exception to this rule. Many men and women who serve our country or fight in other wars give up part of themselves to be in that war. It is our job to remember them, yes, but also to fight for them to get the help that they need. I'm grateful to have this tribute to the men and women that fought in the Vietnam War and who give their lives for our country today. The second topic that this book calls is women, and I think the biggest takeaway is to remember them. It is clear that this book was for the women who contributed their lives to war. Yes, in the past, many women were not able to fight in the war. However, women contributed in so many ways. In this book, we see nurses, yes, but we also see women protesting on behalf of their husbands and fighting to get their POWs back from war. We saw women standing up for each other and helping each other to get through the most difficult parts of their lives. It was a beautiful tribute to women. Overall, I am grateful for novels that cover difficult topics. This novel does not shy away from grief and trauma that comes from war, especially serving in a war that treated its veterans like second-class citizens. Reading this book was difficult, yes, but definitely worth it. I hope that you've enjoyed listening to this episode of According to Your English Teacher. I'd love it if you liked this video and subscribed to the channel. I'd like to leave you with one last quote. The women had a story to tell, even if the world wasn't quite ready to hear it yet. And their story began with 3 simple words: we were there. This episode was written by me, Sam Gunther, and was edited by Dallin Gunther. The music was written by Tom Brinton. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.